Greetings to all lovers of history and gastronomic adventures. Today we will embark on an amazing journey into the past, to the luxurious tables of medieval nobility. You have surely seen scenes of royal feasts in movies, huge halls filled with guests, tables groaning under food, roasted boars with apples in their mouths, endless goblets of wine and unbridled merriment. But how much do these pictures correspond to historical reality? Did kings and dukes of the Middle Ages really eat the way movies show us? Today, we will dispel myths, reveal amazing facts, and immerse ourselves in the real world of medieval haute cuisine. If you are interested in learning about how people actually lived in the past, beyond stereotypes and movie cliches, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We regularly travel through different eras and cultures, revealing fascinating details of our ancestors' daily lives. And now, prepare for a gastronomic journey to the Middle Ages, and I assure you, much of what you learn will surprise you greatly. Let's start with the very concept of royal feast. In medieval times, feasts were not just meals. They were the most important social and political events. The ruler demonstrated his wealth and power, strengthened alliances, made deals, and showed his generosity. Feasts were organized for special occasions, coronations, weddings, important religious holidays, visits of foreign guests, or major military victories. Some feasts could last several days, with new dishes served each day and new entertainments arranged. However, contrary to popular belief, even kings did not organize such grand banquets every day. Daily nutrition, even in royal palaces, was much more modest. This brings us to the first big myth about medieval cuisine: the idea that nobility constantly overate, organizing multi-hour feasts with dozens of dishes. In reality, such feasts were exceptional events, timed to special occasions. Now let's figure out what was actually served at these famous feasts. Contrary to popular opinion, medieval noble cuisine was refined and complex. Cooks at European monarchs' courts were true masters of their craft, and their culinary creations could amaze even modern chefs. Dishes distinguished themselves not only by taste, but also by elaborate presentation. One of the most spectacular elements of medieval feasts were the so-called subtleties or spectacle dishes. These were edible sculptures created to entertain guests. Imagine a castle made of marzipan, a pie shaped like a ship with masts made of dough and sails made of wafers, or a roasted peacock whose feathers were carefully removed before cooking and then reattached to the finished bird for serving. These dishes were true works of art and demonstrated not only the host's wealth, but also his cook's mastery. Contrary to another widespread myth, medieval aristocracy was not limited to roasted meat. The diet was surprisingly diverse. Yes, meat was indeed the basis of the menu, especially at feasts, but it was prepared in various ways: fried, stewed, baked in dough, cooked on a spit. Game, poultry, lamb, beef, and pork were popular. By the way, that very roasted boar with an apple in its mouth that became a symbol of medieval feasting in popular culture was actually served much less often than one might think. This was rather an exceptional festive dish, not everyday food even for kings. Interestingly, medieval cuisine had a real cult of sauces. Meat was rarely served simply roasted. It was usually accompanied by a complex sauce made from dozens of ingredients. These sauces often contained crushed nuts, breadcrumbs, wine, fruits, honey, spices, and herbs. They made dishes not only tastier, but also richer, which was especially important for status demonstration. For example, one popular sauce of that time, cameline, was made from cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, breadcrumbs, and wine. A true symphony of flavors. Spices were an important part of medieval haute cuisine. Contrary to popular belief, they were not used to mask the taste of spoiled meat. First, spices were so expensive that using them to mask spoiled products would have been extremely wasteful. Second, nobility could afford fresh products. Spices were used primarily as a symbol of status and wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, saffron, nutmeg, and cloves were brought from distant lands and cost fabulously expensive. Using large quantities of exotic spices in a dish was a way to demonstrate one's wealth and connections. One of the most valuable spices was saffron, which even today remains one of the most expensive seasonings in the world. It not only gave dishes a characteristic taste, but also colored them golden, which had important symbolic meaning. The golden color was associated with wealth and power, so saffron was often used in dishes served at particularly important feasts. As for sweet dishes, there are interesting discoveries here too. In medieval times, there was no clear division between sweet and savory dishes, as in modern cuisine. Meat was often cooked with fruits and honey, and spicy seasonings could be added to desserts. Sugar, imported from the Middle East, was incredibly expensive and was used not only as a sweetener but also as medicine and even as material for creating decorative elements. Popular desserts at royal feasts were marzipan figurines, waffles with honey, pies with fruits and nuts, candied fruits and berries. Particularly chic were the so-called illusion dishes, desserts that looked like something else. For example, pastries imitating the appearance of meat dishes, or sweets that look like vegetables. Now, let's talk about drinks. Wine was certainly popular at royal feasts, but it was consumed not quite as we might think. Medieval wine was usually quite sour and often diluted with water or sweetened with honey and spices. Popular was Hippocras, wine infused with cinnamon, ginger, and other spices with honey added. Beer was also widely consumed, and several varieties of different strengths could be served at feasts. Interestingly, in medieval times, water was not considered the safest drink, especially in cities, so even children often drank low-alcohol beverages. However, one should not think that everyone at medieval feasts got drunk senseless. For nobility, it was important to maintain dignity, and excessive alcohol consumption was considered improper. Of course, there were exceptions, but in general the aristocracy tried to observe moderation. An interesting aspect of medieval feasts was their symbolic meaning and strict etiquette. The placement of guests at the table was strictly regulated according to their status. The closer to the feast host a guest sat, the higher his status. The most honored guests sat at the high table, a table on an elevation where the host himself also sat. Other guests were placed at long tables perpendicular to the high table. Dishes were also served according to the guest's status. The most expensive and refined dishes were intended for the host and most honored guests. Sometimes the differences were so subtle that a modern person would find them hard to notice, but for medieval people these nuances were extremely important. For example, white bread was intended for highest nobility, bread from less refined flour for knights and minor nobles, and coarse rye bread for servants. It should be noted that medieval feasts were not only meals but also real performances. Between serving dishes, guests were entertained by musicians, acrobats, jugglers, and jesters. Sometimes, even small theatrical productions were staged. The richer the host, the more spectacular these interludes were. Special attention was paid to how dishes were brought to the table. The procession of servants carrying dishes was often accompanied by music and even dancing. Some dishes were brought into the hall with special pomp. For example, a roasted peacock with restored plumage could be brought into the hall on a silver platter carried by a page in special costume, accompanied by trumpeters announcing the appearance of this luxurious dish. Interestingly, contrary to popular belief, medieval people did not eat with their hands, at least not in high society. Knives and spoons were used at royal feasts. Forks appeared in Europe later, but already in the late Middle Ages they began to be used in Italy and other countries. Moreover, each guest usually brought his own knife. Often this was a personal expensive item decorated according to the owner's status. Another important element of the feast was hand washing. Before the meal began and between course changes, servants went around guests with basins and pitchers, offering to wash hands. Often aromatic herbs or flower petals were added to the water. This ritual was not only a hygienic procedure, but also part of the ceremony. Now let's look at a specific example of a medieval royal feast. One of the most famous and well documented was a feast organized in 1387 by English King Richard II. For this feast, a temporary wooden hall measuring 30 by 10 meters was built. At the high table sat the king, bishops, and highest nobility, while at other tables hundreds of guests of lower rank were seated. The menu of this feast included many refined dishes: roasted swans, peacocks and herons, eel aspic, venison pâté, stewed meat in complex sauces, various types of fish. Between main courses, intermediate dishes were served, light appetizers accompanied by artist performances. The feast concluded with a banquet, what medieval times called what we would today call dessert: sweets, fruits, nuts, and sweet wines. It should be noted that such a feast required enormous resources and many servants. Preparation could begin weeks before the event. Game was hunted, exotic products were purchased, complex sauces and dish decorations were prepared. On the feast day, dozens of cooks, assistants, and servants worked in the kitchen. Interestingly, feast waste was not thrown away. There was a custom of alms dishes. Food remains were collected and distributed to the poor. This was considered a pious deed that demonstrated the host's generosity and care for his subjects. If we compare medieval royal feasts with modern official banquets, we will find both differences and surprising similarities. The main difference is perhaps that medieval feasts were much more theatrical and symbolic. Every aspect of the feast, from guest placement to the order of dish serving, had its meaning and was strictly regulated. At the same time as today, official meals were a way to demonstrate status, establish connections, and impress guests. It's important to understand that medieval aristocratic cuisine was not primitive or crude. On the contrary, it was refined, complex, and diverse. Cooks of that time possessed deep knowledge about flavor and texture combinations, about cooking methods and dish presentation. Many principles they were guided by are relevant in modern haute cuisine too. It's also worth mentioning cookbooks that have survived from those times. One of the most famous is The Form of Curry, written around 1390 for English King Richard II's cook. It contains recipes for refined dishes, many of which could surprise a modern person with their complexity and unusual ingredient combinations. For example, blancmange, a delicate dish of minced chicken, rice, almond milk, and sugar, or tarte de brie, a pie with cheese, eggs, and spices. In France, the famous culinary treatise Le Grand Cuisinier was compiled in the early 14th century. It contains not only recipes, but also advice on organizing banquets, table setting, and even on choosing kitchen staff. These sources allow us today to recreate authentic medieval dishes and better understand the gastronomic culture of that time. However, when talking about medieval feasts, it's important to remember the context. While nobility enjoyed refined dishes, most of the population, peasants and urban poor, ate much more modestly. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasionally meat. The gap between rich and poor nutrition was enormous, reflecting the general social inequality of medieval society. It's also interesting to note that aristocratic nutrition varied depending on the European region. Italian nobility, for example, consumed more fruits, vegetables, and pasta than their northern neighbors. In England and northern France, they preferred meat and game. In coastal regions, fish and seafood played an important role in the diet. Moreover, the diet changed depending on the season and the church calendar. On fast days, of which there were many in the medieval calendar, even at royal tables meat was replaced with fish and vegetables. Speaking of medieval feasts, one cannot fail to mention such an important aspect as tableware. Contrary to popular belief, even in the early Middle Ages, nobility did not eat from wooden bowls. Luxurious tableware made of silver and gold, often richly decorated, was used for royal feasts. Products made from rock crystal and semi-precious stones were especially valued. Glass tableware, especially Venetian glass, was also highly valued and was an indicator of wealth. Each guest usually had his own plate and sometimes a personal drinking cup. Another interesting aspect of medieval feasts was the medical theory that influenced menu composition. Medieval medicine was based on the doctrine of four humors, fluids, in the human body: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. It was believed that health depended on the balance of these humors, and food products could influence this balance as they possessed their own properties, hot or cold, dry or wet. Therefore, when composing menus, not only the taste combination of dishes was considered, but also their effect on guests' health. For example, it was believed that after fatty meat, hot and wet, it was beneficial to consume pears, cold and dry, to restore balance. It's curious that some rules of medieval table etiquette have survived to our days. For example, the rule not to put elbows on the table, not to speak with a full mouth, not to reach across the whole table for a dish. In medieval times, these rules were especially important as it was believed that table manners reflected a person's character and upbringing. Summing up our gastronomic journey to the Middle Ages, we can say that royal feasts of that time were much more complex and refined than commonly thought. These were not just meals, but true works of art where every detail had meaning and where food was only one element of a complex cultural and social action. Many dishes served at these feasts could surprise and even delight a modern gourmet with their complexity, refinement, and unusual flavor combinations. Interestingly, some medieval culinary traditions are experiencing a revival today. Haute cuisine chefs turned to ancient recipes seeking inspiration, and history and gastronomy enthusiasts organized reconstructions of medieval feasts, trying to recreate the atmosphere and tastes of that era. Thanks to surviving cookbooks and other historical sources, we can not only read about what our ancestors ate, but also try to prepare these dishes ourselves, thus making a real journey through time through taste sensations. I hope this journey into the world of medieval haute cuisine was as fascinating for you as it was for me. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss new episodes about amazing aspects of everyday history. And in the comments, tell us which of the described medieval dishes you would like to try. Maybe you have already tried reconstructions of historical recipes or even cooked them yourself. In the following episodes, we will continue our journey through the history of daily life of different eras and cultures, revealing a little known but fascinating details of how people of the past lived, what they ate, what they wore, and what they did. After all, it is in these details of everyday life that the real history of humanity is revealed. Until we meet again, and bon appétit!